Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay, well then I'll introduce you. Hey everyone, thank you for coming to this TINS. I'm Holly, I'm chairing the session today. And today we have Dr. Alison Fildes. So she's an associate professor based in the Appetite and Obesity Research Group within the School of Psychology at the University of Leeds. So Ali is interested in the individual and environmental influences on people's eating behaviour, alongside their impacts on body weight and health. And her work examines the causes of obesity and develops and evaluates behavioural interventions targeting energy balance behaviours and obesity prevention, as well as translating this evidence into policy. Well, she holds an honorary position at University College London's Department of Behavioural Science and Health, and is Deputy Director of the Gemini Study, which is a large population-based birth cohort of British twins established to examine genetic and environmental contributions to growth, energy balance behaviours, and well-being from infancy into early adulthood. So Ali also works closely with the Nutrition and Lifestyle Analytics team at the University of Leeds to explore how best to promote healthy and sustainable consumer behaviour. So please help me in welcoming Ali.
Thank you, Holly, and thanks very much for having me here today. So, as Holly said, my background is more in child eating behaviour and the kind of behavioural aspects of diet and eating in early childhood that determine excess weight gain. But this is a little bit of a deviation from that background of work, where I've been working with a group at Leeds looking at specifically at the legislation that was introduced in the UK in 2022 to restrict the placement of HFSS products in English supermarkets. So this is just a declaration of interest. So whilst the data I'll be presenting is provided by large retailers in the UK, they didn't provide any funding for this research. So this research was funded by the UKRI in the UK, and as well with some funding from IGD, which is the Institute of Grocery Distribution, through their social impact programs. I just wanted to very quickly thank my co-authors and contributors to this work. So this is a huge undertaking, and it certainly wasn't all me or even close. So just to be clear on that from the start. So the HFSS legislation in England is a landmark policy. So England was the first country to introduce legislation of this kind, with the idea that essentially the shopping environment impacts the products that we purchase, and the location of certain products within stores significantly affects what we buy. So essentially, the current retailer environment tends to promote less healthy foods through their placement. So it's typically the less healthy products that have these higher profit margins, and that therefore get promoted in these key locations within supermarkets. And the result of this is it's harder for families to make healthier choices when they're shopping. So the idea behind this legislation was to restrict essentially what products could go in these key places, prime places in store, and hopefully support people to lead healthier lives as a result. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with where the geography of the UK, but it's important just for what I'm describing here, that due to devolution, this legislation was introduced in England only in October 2022. And during that period that we're talking about, where this work was conducted, we were working closely with the devolved nations, so with Scotland and Wales, to let them know our findings as they were going on, because they have now introduced this legislation in Wales. So that happened in April of this year, and it's planned to come into force in Scotland in October of this year. So this is the timeline of the legislation. So it was first announced in 2020, with the original implementation date supposed to be April 2022. This was pushed back. So the draft regulations were only published in October in 2021. The guidance came out in April 2022, and the restrictions themselves didn't actually come into force until October 2022. So these are the restrictions on the location of HFSS products in supermarkets. There was a second round of legislation that was supposed to be introduced at the same time, but then ended up getting pushed back several times and was finally introduced in October 2025, which restricts essentially multi-buy, so price promotions, buy one, get one free, and things like that. But I'm not focusing on that legislation today. So the HFSS legislation is quite complex. It applies to only high-fat, salt, sugar products that fall within 13 in-scope categories, defined, and they have to be defined as high-fat, sugar and salt by the 2004 nutrient profile model, which is a model that was developed in the UK as part of advertising restrictions. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So it only applies to businesses with over 50 employees and stores that are greater than 2,000 square foot. And it applies to specifically checkout areas, end of aisles, and store entrances. So these are the areas that are restricted, that aren't allowed high-fat, salt, sugar products to be displayed. So the businesses themselves, so the retailers, were responsible for ensuring compliance. That in itself is quite complex because they don't always have all the information about the products. That comes from the manufacturers in a lot of circumstances, and it's not always shared. Whereas local authorities are responsible for the enforcement of the legislation. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this is just to illustrate some of the complexity around the legislation. So it had to fall within one of these 13 categories that I've listed on the left. So things that are out of scope were things like alcohol, baby food, some other, I think, party foods, various select sandwiches, I think, were outside of the scope of the legislation. They had to be sold packaged. So whilst donuts that come in a pack would be covered by the legislation, the bakery, in-store bakery wouldn't. So unpackaged. So you can still see kind of rows of Krispy Kremes at the end of aisles and things like that because you buy them unpackaged. So that's quite confusing. And then also the product has to fail the NPM score. So some things that are out of scope would be score? The nutrient profile modeling score. Okay. I'll explain that in one sec. So things that have a higher fruit content might pass. Things like some cereals, even though you might consider them to be HFSS, actually pass the score based on fibre content and other things. So it's quite complex deciding what falls within scope of the legislation. So this is just to briefly explain the UK nutrient profile model. So products get A points for being unhealthy. They get C points for being more healthy, essentially. That's the idea. So you minus the C points from the A points. And if it's greater or equal to 4, it fails for a food, and that's 1 for a drink. So there's always extra caveats. But then there's an additional issue around protein that, to do with kind of if it scores more than 11 A points, it can't score points for protein unless it scores 5 points for fruit. I mean, it gets quite complex, you can imagine. So this is only important when you think about the difficulty of applying legislation like this, both for the retailers and also the enforcement officers and ourselves when we're trying to evaluate the legislation. There's a little QR code there if you want to try a calculation for yourself, because it's sometimes surprising what falls within and without the nutrient profile model. The other thing is that they've now updated the nutrient profile model in the UK, so there will be an updated version, but this was the original one that this legislation worked with. And in terms of the restricted areas in store, so it was end of aisles, around the entrances, and on kind of key thoroughfares, so near the checkouts as well. So even that was relatively complex for stores to calculate where things weren't allowed to be placed. So our research, the aim of our research was to evaluate the impacts of this legislation, but also to understand how it was implemented and how it was received. So as part of this, we conducted a survey with customers, we ran interviews and surveys with retailers, and we analysed 2.5 years worth of product sales data from stores across England. So the first findings I'm going to present are around how the legislation was implemented by retailers and what customers thought. So shoppers' responses to the legislation. We wanted to know how frequently shoppers reported purchasing HFSS products following the introduction of the legislation and whether this varied by customer demographics. We wanted to understand whether customers reported how much susceptibility they reported to retailer strategies, and again, whether this varied by demographics, and the extent to which customers were even aware of the HFSS legislation and how much they were in favour of it. So we surveyed just under 2,000 primary grocery shoppers in England, and they completed an online survey, and they reported on things like household food insecurity, their purchasing patterns, the susceptibility, as I said, to product placement and promotions, and their awareness of the legislation and changes that have followed the legislation. So our sample was just over half female. Importantly, 24.2% of the adults in our sample were living with food insecurity. So this is slightly higher than the national average. We specifically oversampled people from low SES backgrounds. Over a third had at least one child under 16 in the household, and the rates of obesity and overweight were quite similar to the national averages. And 33 or 34% nearly had a household income of less than £26,000. So that's about, I think, $50,000. So we did have quite a high percentage of lower income households. So this is just to show you that most people are purchasing the majority of the different categories that were covered by the legislation quite frequently. And in fact, 92.5% reported purchasing from at least one of these categories once or more per week. So people are buying HFSS foods really regularly, probably more regularly than they said in this survey, to be honest. And we know that from sales data as well. What we also found was that families with children reported more frequently purchasing HFSS products from basically all the categories apart from ready meals compared to those without children. Whereas those with food insecurity were more frequently purchasing things like soft drinks, pizza, potato-based products, and ready meals, but were less frequently purchasing things like, by morning goods, you're talking about things like croissants and stuff like that. So again, nothing particularly surprising in this data. But it does show that this legislation won't necessarily impact all groups equally, and that's what we were essentially interested in. And shoppers with children reported being more likely to buy products from store entrances, aisle ends, and checkout areas. So these key locations. Yeah, hi.
So can I just clarify? When you say shoppers with children,
yeah,
you mean people who have children, or you mean people who took children shopping with them?
They have children, so we don't know if they're with them when they're shopping. Some of these people are also shopping online. So whether or not you have children, my assumption to some extent would be that if you take a child with you, you're particularly susceptible to this because you've got the pest to power aspect going on. Yeah.
Just about online shopping. So how does the, in the physical shopping, here, how does that play out to the online shopping?
Yeah, so it's similar. So they're not allowed to promote these products on things like your opening page as you go through. They don't appear in the same way in the kind of online space as they would in the physical space, essentially. So we were interested in that for the survey. The sales data, we just looked at in-store purchasing. So that's worth bearing in mind. And we also asked them about the susceptibility to price promotion, even though that wasn't covered by the current legislation. Just in terms of the second aspect, the second step in this legislation. And shoppers with children and those with food insecurity, again, were more likely to purchase products on price promotion, which again makes sense. Most people weren't aware of the legislation and hadn't noticed any changes in store. A few more had noticed online, but not really. This isn't surprising. So this legislation essentially relies on non-conscious purchasing habits. So there was no reason for the government to publicise this legislation. It wasn't something that you needed people to understand in order to have any effect. So it relies on kind of affecting impulse purchasing, which by definition is almost non-conscious. So this isn't that surprising. But when we explained the legislation to customers, the majority felt it was a good first step to encourage healthier foods. So there's a lot of rhetoric in the British media and probably internationally as well around kind of push back against this kind of legislation, talking about nanny state issues and like the fact that people should be given the choice, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't find that people thought that when you actually asked them about it. This kind of legislation, and I guess because it doesn't focus on things like price and stuff like that, it is just about product placement. It does have general positive responses when you explain it to people. Most people felt it was likely to impact other shoppers who didn't plan their shopping. But again, nearly 3/4 didn't think it would have any impact on their own shopping. Mm-hmm. And this is what you see when you ask people about behaviour change interventions. Everybody thinks they themselves are immune to it, but that it will affect other people. So we weren't that surprised by that, but it's interesting to see here. And the key thing that we found that although people were in favour of the legislation, more than anything, what they wanted to see was actually healthier food being more affordable. So they wanted legislation to promote healthier food more than they wanted legislation to restrict unhealthier food. And when you ask them what they wanted on price promotion and in these key locations in the store, it was fruit and vegetables. That's what people were asking for. So when we looked at the business level response to the legislation, we were interested in what the barriers were to implementation, the resources required for implementation, and how it was interpreted by the retail sector. So for this, we did interviews with 3 of the largest UK retailers, the British Retail Consortium and Local Authority Enforcement. And we did rapid qualitative analysis based on the predefined protocol. And we also, alongside the interviews, we were trying to get a basically business level response. So we sent each of the 4 main retailers that we had involved in the study questionnaires, and we allowed multiple people within those businesses to feed into these questionnaires in an attempt to get a better understanding at a business level of what was happening in response to the legislation. So this is how our mixed methods paper summed it up. It was a force for good, but. So people said they thought it was a great idea, but there was a lot of issues with the legislation. So as I showed in the timeline, the deadlines were tight for the implementation of this legislation, and the guidance that was provided to retailers was incomplete, which created uncertainty and made it quite difficult. There was limited two-way communication with government bodies, so when retailers were asking for clarity, they weren't always getting it. So this is a major problem. The absence of a universally available product nutrient composition database posed challenges. So the retailers was responsible for implementing this legislation, but they didn't always have the data to categorize foods. So they had back of pack information, but that's not what you need to complete the nutrient profile model. You need lots of additional information that just isn't available. So they had to work with, so there's a company called Brand Bank. They had to buy that data. We had to buy that data to do this analysis. And the enforcement officers did not have access to that data. So that created a lot of problems. There was also difficulties translating the legislation for staff. So if you're trying to explain, why one donut is allowed to be placed there, but another isn't, it creates problems for people working within stores. And the fact that there was, that these businesses operate across the UK, but this legislation only applied to England, made that quite difficult. So as a result, essentially, they often implemented this legislation in Scotland and Wales to some extent at the same time, just for ease. And when you're thinking about things like reformulation, you can't reformulate for one area. It makes it quite difficult. So they talked about the importance of external support. So the British Retail Consortium helped actually interpret the legislation for the retailers when the government wasn't providing that information. They also talked about the value of insights from trials. So the retailers ran their own trials of parts of the intervention, and they were learning from each other. They dedicated specific teams to coordinate this. So one retailer said there was like 230 plus people allocated specifically to the implementation of the legislation. It costs, some retailers talked about it costing millions to implement. And whilst there was a few reporting of a few enforcement incidents, like people coming into store to enforce immediately following the legislation, there was no fines or anything like that implemented, and one of the retailers didn't have any enforcement whatsoever. Interestingly, there was, so there was some calling out of each other, and there's an online magazine called The Grocer that was also, there was basically supermarkets were getting called out, but not by enforcement officers, essentially. So they're a bit more worried about that. When it came to the actual implementation of it, when we asked retailers what they were putting at the end of aisles, so they talked about putting non-HFSS products, but they also talked about putting things that just fell outside of the scope of the legislation. So exempt products such as alcohol. Baby food wasn't covered by the legislation, but there's obviously many issues with the promotion of that also. They would, in some cases, whilst the actual product wasn't at the end of aisle, there would be an advert for it, or a digital advert for the product. All kind of food would be moved to one location within the store. So, rather than having all of your Easter eggs as you walked in, they moved it to another kind of relatively high traffic area within store. They made changes to store layouts. So in aisle promotional spaces got increased. In some cases, they widened the aisles and put freestanding baskets in the middle, essentially, so they could put HFSS products as you were literally walking through the aisles. Some stores reduced their total square foot by increasing storage areas or cafes and things like that, so they fell outside of scope of the legislation. And things like in-store bakery, which was, again, not packaged, so out of scope, got expanded to fill some of these locations. So there was a lot of kind of different approaches taken to implementing the legislation. And in terms of reformulation, so some manufacturers and retailers responded through the reformulation of products. And when we asked the retailers about reformulation, 3 of the 4 said that it accelerated their reformulation. And the 4th said it was now a key consideration. And one retailer actually estimated that about 10% of its total portfolio was considered for reformulation as a result of the legislation. So it's clearly having an impact on the formulation of these products and new products in both manufacturers and retailers. So from this side, the mixed method side of the research, we found that customers and stakeholders were actually generally supportive of the legislation's aims. So the stakeholders we spoke to were supportive of the aims of the legislation, with the caveat that there was a lot of issues with the implementation. Customers viewed the promotion and affordability of healthy foods as more important, and retailers faced significant barriers to both interpretation and implementation. So the complexity of the legislation and grey areas led to these kind of varied strategies to achieve compliance. And it's interesting because some of these strategies were certainly fell within the lines of the legislation. So they weren't breaking the legislation, but arguably weren't within the spirit of it. But when you spoke to some of the representatives, they were more concerned about their competitors doing these things. So actually, what they said they would have liked was much stricter regulation to create more of a level playing field. So the idea that they were worried that if another retailer was doing these strategies, then they had to compete. Whereas if they'd been told you absolutely can't do this, they in some ways would have preferred it. And enforcement was very limited. So with all of those kind of caveats, the question is, did the legislation actually reduce purchasing of high-fat salt sugar products? And we were also interested in whether the impacts of the legislation were equitable. So I'm going to get on to the sales data now. So the first question was what were the impacts of the HFSS product placement legislation on scales of in-scope products in stores in England? And were the impacts of the legislation equitable across different deciles of the Priority Places for Food Index? So you might well not have heard of the Priority Places for Food Index. So this is a composite index that identifies neighbourhoods that are most vulnerable to both the cost of living increases within the UK and less access to affordable, healthy and sustainable food. So we've since repeated this analysis using an index of multiple deprivation as well, but I can't present those results here, but I will present the results by the Priority Places for Food Index. So what we did was we used daily food and drink sales data for up to 18 months before the legislation was introduced in October 2022, and for 12 months after it was introduced from 4 major UK retailers. So they collectively represent 65% of UK supermarket sales. So that's Asda, Morrisons, Sainsbury's and Tesco. Data obtained from 640 stores across England, so that's 160 per retailer, and 200 stores across Scotland and Wales. And we made sure we selected an equal number of stores from each decile of the Priority Places for Food Index to try and get an idea of about this aspect of equitability. And product nutrition data for branded and own brand food and beverage products was obtained from both the retailers and from Brand Bank. As I said, we had to buy this data in order to be able to assign the high-fat salt sugar status to the sold products and to understand what was in scope and out of scope of the legislation. So to give you some idea of the scale of this data, because this is huge. So because of the amount of data and the amount of work involved, even just applying the categorization to know whether things were HFSS or not, it took a very long time. As a result, we only managed to actually complete the analysis for 3 of the 4 retailers. So I'm going to be presenting results from the 3 retailers here. Within those 3 retailers, there was 11.6 billion items sold over the study period. So we had 2.5 years of daily store level data from 480 stores. That's 37,000 unique products per retailer and 6.8 billion kilograms of products sold over the study period. So this is just a huge volume of data. I'm not a data scientist. I didn't have to do this, but you can imagine how much work this was. It was enormous. And the planned approach to looking at whether or not there was an effect of the legislation on the sale of these products. We originally planned to do a controlled interrupted time series analysis. So the idea was that we would use stores in England and compare them to what's happened in stores in Scotland and Wales, because the legislation wasn't being implemented there. Now, the problem with this was, as I said, we know from our mixed method work that actually it wasn't introduced cleanly in England and not introduced in Scotland and Wales, which I suppose we could have predicted if we'd thought about it beforehand, but we didn't. So it wasn't mandated outside England, but it was just too much work for these retailers to try and have all these different rules applied across different. So whilst it probably wasn't implemented to the same degree in Scotland and Wales, it was implemented. Reformulation happened everywhere. And if you think about the fact that online stores as well, so you could be living in Wales, but your local store could be in England. So you would be ordering from one or vice versa. So it's very difficult. Like there isn't clear boundaries between the devolved nations. And yeah, as I said, reformulation happened across the UK. So our control sample was contaminated. As a result, we used an interrupted time series analysis to estimate the effect of the legislation. So this was to compare the data pre-implementation to the data post-implementation to see if there was an effect. And we ran separate analysis for each retailer for the stores in England. We also did it for Scotland and Wales, but not as a control. and separately. And then effect estimates were pooled in a random effects meta-analysis to see what the overall effect was across the 3 stores. So just in case people aren't familiar with interrupted time series analysis, essentially this relies on the fact that you use the data from before the implementation of the legislation to predict what is going to happen after the introduction of the legislation, and then look at what actually happened and compare the two. So you've got a factual and a counterfactual. So the factual is what actually happened, and the counterfactual is what you've estimated would have happened if the legislation hadn't been introduced based on the data you have before it was introduced, if that makes sense. And apologies if it doesn't, I'm not a statistician. So this is the results for retailer A, B, and C. So in the main squares, you've got the estimated step change following the introduction of the legislation. And you've got the 95% confidence interval. So with an interrupted time series analysis, what you're looking at is whether there was a step change following the introduction, in this case of the introduction of the legislation, or whether there was a slope change. So what we saw was a step change for retailer A and C, and you can see that there was no significant effect for retailer B. So if you think of the dotted line as the no effect line, the step change wasn't significant for retailer B. But at the bottom, we've got the pooled estimate, and you can see overall in the meta-analysis, there was a significant reduction in sales of HFSS products by weight following the introduction of the legislation. So these are the baseline, so this is just to show you what the baseline HFSS sales were for each of these retailers and overall. And the change was, change was given there for each of the individual retailers and overall. So it was a 1.19 percentage point decrease in units sold. So this is just to show you essentially what we're looking at. So the pre-legislation, the forecast and the post-legislation, and we saw this step change. We didn't see a slope change. So it wasn't that there continued to be a decrease in the sales of these products, or that there was, any slant that changed essentially post-legislation. What you saw was this sudden drop. Now, this is interesting because we often get asked, how do you know that it's the effect of the legislation, not the effect of kind of things like cost of living and all these post-COVID, everything else that was going on geopolitically as well at the time. But we know that you're unlikely to see this sudden drop with things like that because the cost of living crisis had started previously, was ongoing. You would expect to see a slope change, which we did not see. So before the legislation, HFSS products made up 9.4% of the total weight and nearly 20% of the total units of food and drink sold in these retailers in the UK, or in England, sorry. And following the legislation, there was a 0.63 percentage point reduction by weight and a 1.19 percentage point reduction by units sold as a proportion of total sales. So this is equivalent to a 6.7% relative decrease by weight and a 6.1% relative decrease by unit of in-scope product sales. This is important because when we first announced these findings with the percentage point reductions, people didn't understand them, and there was a lot of reporting of like, well, that's nothing, that means nothing. But actually, we're talking about huge amounts here. And just to put that in perspective, the estimated reduction of HFSS purchases is attributable to the legislation. We estimated to be about 220,000 tonnes over a year, which is 2 million fewer HFSS products sold following the introduction of the legislation per day. So that's huge. You wouldn't get 2 million products in this room. I don't think it's a lot. So just to kind of push back against some of that, this doesn't matter response that we got. And the next question was that were these impacts equitable? So I mentioned the priority places for food index. These are the different factors that are taken into this composite measure that make up the priority places for food. So things like proximity to retailers, access to online deliveries, alongside kind of economic barriers. And what we found was that actually you saw these impacts across the different deciles of the priority places for food index were equal. So all areas were affected equally. We have to be careful with the wording, because actually for it to be equitable, I suppose you would need to have an increased impact in those more deprived groups who are more susceptible in the first place. But there wasn't an increase of inequality as a result of this legislation. I think we can hopefully quite clearly state, which is really promising as well. So the key takeaways from the sales data. So this was the first study to use supermarket sales data from 3 major UK retailers to evaluate the effectiveness of the legislation. It's also, the first study to use this amount of sales data from this. Often when you're doing kind of purchasing based analysis, you're relying on things like receipts or loyalty card data, but you're talking about much smaller samples. This was store level data, which means we can't talk about individual effects on individual customers, but we can talk about these kind of massive amounts of data, essentially. So the legislation reduced sales of in-scope products as a proportion of total products by both weight and volume, and they were equal across different areas with different priority needs for food. So the findings were really promising and demonstrated that restricting placement-based promotion of less healthy foods can lead to meaningful changes in sales. So we were really pleased to get these results and to show. I think when governments introduce this kind of legislation, they're up against a lot of pushback. There's a lot of people that kind of want to say it's not worth it. It's not going to have. It's not going to change the obesity rates. No legislation by itself is going to solve obesity, but this has definitely shown this legislation is doing something to improve the obesogenic environment, essentially, that we live in. And off the back of this, we created 8 policy recommendations. So these can be kind of divided into 2, ones that build on the current legislation and ones that are helpful for the development and enforcement of food legislation more generally. So our recommendations were that the legislation needs strengthening to mandate against the promotion of less healthy foods. So whilst the legislation was effective, it could have been more effective. And we showed with the qualitative analysis, the things that went wrong with the implementation or could have been done better. So reducing the out of scope categories, making it a bit tighter would have prevented some of these unintended consequences. We haven't looked at we wanted to look at the impact on the healthiness of baskets, essentially. So looking at against how the overall baskets were affected by the legislation. Again, because of the massive amount of work that went into this, we haven't got there yet, but it's still part of the plan. But it would also be interesting to know what unintended consequences of this. So how did sales of things like alcohol or out of scope HFSS products change as a result of this legislation? We don't have the answers to that yet. Not only should legislation focus on the unhealthy products, but ensuring healthier products are more affordable. So it would have been great if the legislation had mandated what should have been placed in these locations as a result of removal of the HFSS. So instead, and they could have been directly replaced by, clearly healthier food rather than just things that fell out of scope of the legislation. A major problem that was a barrier to implementation, a barrier to enforcement, and a barrier to evaluation was access to data. So calling for an open and regularly updated food composition database for classification of food and drinks. And there are steps being made in this direction in the UK now. And also the need for evidence-based public health legislation. So making sure that sufficient funding for evidence generation and evaluation, it's basically a call for kind of giving us more money, but to make sure that the right legislation is implemented and that it is evaluated appropriately. in terms of the broader recommendations, so we would call for co-production with organisations across the food sector. So that's not to say that the food industry should be involved in coming up with this legislation, not calling for that. But, you know, in terms of understanding how it's going to be implemented, if you don't have an open dialogue, then some of these unintended consequences might have been picked up sooner if someone was speaking to someone with a greater understanding of the retail environment. The legislation has to be enforceable. So funding, training, data access, and the tools needed for enforcement were lacking in this case. And without enforcement, we don't know what's happened down the line. If nobody's enforcing this legislation, to what extent is it being continued within the retail environment? And we haven't looked at that. We don't have the data to look at that. But so the other step is aligning government departments. I think there's 16 government departments in the UK that have interests in food and with different priorities. So that's quite complex when you're trying to get legislation through and they're not all talking to each other. So you need that joining up and dedicated support and guidance to facilitate the implementation of the legislation. So making sure that there's clear guidance and mechanisms for kind of responding to queries and questions to make sure that this level playing field that everybody says they want is achieved. So that's pretty much it. I just wanted to provide the QR code, the difference. So the customer level insights and the business level insights are both published and available. The main sales data paper, have I got that up here? So that's just, I think we've got, yeah, I think that might be just the protocol that's up there. Anyway, it's coming out, it's open access available, but it's under its second round of review. So we're hoping that comes out very soon. And I just wanted to say thank you to the team. This is us when we presented our findings at Westminster last year. But yeah, it was a huge body of work and a lot of people that went into this. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank everybody involved. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. I'll just facilitate.
Hi, I'm going to facilitate the Q&A, and there are lots of hands. So I saw Louise first.
Thank you so much, Ali. That's such an interesting, that's quite an amazing amount of work and great to see this sort of scrutiny on this legislation. Do you have any information about what this meant in terms of the retailer? If they've had 1.9, whatever it is, this decrease in sales, what did they have an increase in other things? What happened to their income over that period of time? Do you have any insights into that?
Yeah, not really. So we haven't looked at, and that's what we would like to do, to see kind of how the composition of the basket changed as a result of the legislation. I don't think there's been any effect in that you would see a reduction in overall sales. So I don't think it's impacted profit margins as far as we're aware. But we can't say what changed. And that is the next step. And we have got someone trying to work on that at the moment. The problem is obviously we're trying to get additional funding to do these extra pieces of work. And we need to keep the retailers on board with allowing us to do that as well. But sadly, we can't say anything. I don't think it, overall affected profit margins of the supermarkets, but yeah, don't know what happened in terms of the sales of the other products.
Thank you, Ali. That is a tremendous amount of work. But I'm wondering, have you now just proved what the retailers already knew for ages? Hence, that was the basis of their marketing strategies in the first place. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if there was an avenue or any consideration for, prior to this study, where you could subpoena or some way get the marketing strategies, their data from the retailers, which already showed why they did that in the first place. And it would also be interesting to know what is the motivation behind that? Is it purely for their own personal sales, or are there incentives from particular producers to make sure that their products are in certain positions in the market, etc.? How that plays out?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think when that was one of the criticisms when this legislation was, proposed, people were like, well, it won't have any effect. And my argument was always, well, why are these products there if it's not going to have any effect? Because the manufacturers are paying to have products in these prime locations. That's why they're in prime locations. They also have higher profit margins. So it makes sense for a retailer to put the products with the highest profit margins in the places, hence why alcohol has been moved there in a lot of cases. So it makes sense to retailers for that reason. So it's not surprising that it works from that perspective, because this has been going on for years. I mean, the same reason that advertising occurs, right? It obviously works. There is now the legislation happening in the UK around mandating reporting of sales of products. And so that will help, I suppose, hold retailers to account in terms of they have to say what they're selling. It's difficult because we spoke to representatives from each of the businesses, and we quite closely worked with kind of the supermarket nutritionists. Their goal, they're very much interested in increasing the health, and as a whole, these businesses are interested in improving the health of their customers. But you have a lot of different people within these businesses that have competing interests, and not everybody has that goal. And obviously, profit margins is a big aspect. So I think whilst we have shown what you might expect, that is, putting products in these key locations does increase sales of them. I suppose we haven't shown whether or not putting healthy products in the same locations could have the same effect. And that would be something that I would be interested in. There's a lot of pushback around that because it is challenging in a way to put things that need refrigeration and stuff in some of these key locations. But I'd argue there are products, you've got your tins, your pulses, all of those kind of things that would be better placed. And with reformulation, I mean, so Cocoa Pops doesn't fall within the legislation. Things like Haribo introduced sweets that didn't have the sugar content that meant that they fell out of scope, and then companies would pay for the shelf space for the out of scope products that are essentially probably leading people to buy the in scope products. So there's a lot of different ways that this legislation could have been tightened, but I don't think we're just proving what we already knew, because nobody knew that legislating in this way could actually impact sales. So I think, it is novel in that sense, but I do agree with you. I think this is something that manufacturers and businesses have known for many years.
Do you have any idea what was different about retailer B?
Yeah, I'm not allowed to say which retailer was which. That is very much sensitive information. So it's difficult to know. It might be how they implemented the legislation, but it also could be something different about the data. So we didn't have the same amount of pre-legislation data from every one of the supermarkets. So it could have been not as, our prediction could have been not as good. Or the other thing is that not all of the supermarkets implemented it at the date of enforcement. Some of them implemented things earlier. So if they had less pre-data and they implemented stuff earlier, we just don't have as good data to make that prediction. So, or it could be differences in reformulation. It's really difficult to know. But we saw the same thing in Scotland and Wales. So we saw overall effects and effects for retailers A and C, but not B in Scotland and Wales as well. So, yeah.
There's actually one at the back next, and then thank you. That was just absolutely amazing. Just wondering if that the same type of thing was happening online in terms of product placement.
Yeah.
And is there anything on the wings in Australia?
Anything on what, sorry?
Is there anything that's planned for Australia as well in terms of this level of legislation and all things?
So online, I've got no idea of the effect because we didn't have that data. It's difficult to know. I don't know I don't know if there's enough evidence on the effectiveness of the online promotional strategy to know whether it would be as effective to remove it. I think what we know about the way people shop online is they often have set things in their basket that they just put in again. So it's possible that it wouldn't be as effective online because people aren't swayed in the same way. There might be by price promotion slightly more, I'm not sure, but I can't answer that. In terms of what's planned in Australia, I was kind of hoping somebody might tell me that. I mean, around the time that we presented these results, there was talk in the UK of repealing this legislation, which was really frustrating. And, we've got another new Prime Minister now. So it'd be interesting to know what happens going forwards. Our hope is that, we can feed this evidence back and ensure more and stricter legislation rather than the repealing of existing legislation. But it's difficult. It's difficult to know what will happen.
Louise Bow here again. Just on that issue, to talk about Australian things, I presume you're aware of the Refresh Centre of Research.
Yes.
Anna Peters and others were originally involved. So that's based at Monash and Deakin.
Yeah.
And this is a Centre of Research Excellence, and it's in its second phase. So it's the Refreshed Next Generation, working to improve population diet and health by developing and translating evidence-based strategies to make retail food environments healthier. So they're actually working with the retail environments. They've been doing it, so they must be now in about their 7th year of actually doing this work. And they've got a whole lot of ways in which they're working. That's not really answering that question, but it's important to know that there is that piece of work.
So I presented to them.
I thought you would.
Yeah. Okay, I presented to them in 2 weeks, but actually some work from them went into the development of this legislation.
Okay,
so they did feed into it, but I don't know where the Australian government is in terms of implementing policy.
That's a different. It's not quite answering that, but there are other things that are relevant.
Thank you, Louise.
Interesting.
Alison, thank you very much. A stepwise change of the scale you've observed, we're observing, should be significant in terms of population health. So how are we going to determine whether that's true, and how long do we have to wait?
Yeah, great question. So again, when this first came out, what everybody wanted to know was, what does this mean in terms of calories, and what's the impact on population weight, essentially, given it's an obesity policy. And the answer is we don't know. So it's difficult because we don't have individual customer sales data. We only have store level sales data. But the hope was to take this to the next step, to work out essentially what that means for health. So to look at what's the change, essentially, I guess, in terms of calories, in terms of the energy density of products sold and things. And we've got a research scientist that's applying for fellowships to try and take that forward. The funding landscape is really challenging. It's difficult because it feels like we've got all this data, it's a clear win, like no one else has this data and no one else can do this, but it's not enough.
It's surprising your government isn't interested in population level health data in response to a trial that's been successful like this.
I completely agree. Yeah. We thought, maybe, that this would lead to. It hasn't yet. We will see.
Responding a bit to Arthur. So in Latin America, in Chile has had this introduction of sort of quite a lot of strategies to decrease intake of these ultra processed and other foods. So it's included like octagons and other things, school level interventions. And Mexico separately has had a range of things which have included the first really whole of country sugar sweetened beverage levy there. And both of them, about 10 to 15 years after implementing these things, a good 10 years afterwards, are, just like now, showing that there's been some change in Chile. They published like a couple of months ago, a decrease in percentage obesity in kids, but it takes forever. And Mexico's also shown some improvement, it seems, in dental caries. But we're talking about like a decade or more to get data, and it's so difficult to get it, and you need to have it implemented over a long time. And of course, and both of those countries are ones where it was multiple interventions that were happening, not just legislation, but other things as well.
Yeah.
And so whether this is enough.
Well, I mean, we've got the sugar sweetened beverage tax in the UK as well. We've got this. We've now got they've introduced several rounds of legislation restricting the promotion of HFSS products to children through advertising. So we've now got a 9 p.m. watershed. We've got nothing on children's programming. And then there's recently the price promotion legislation as well. So maybe 10 years from now, we'll see it in the National Child Measurement Programme data or something like that. But then people always question, how much the people that want to find a reason will find a reason, because it's how can you attribute that necessarily to those things? But yes, it's really hard to do. And the data linkage is really hard to do as well.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. My question is on a slide that was a bit further back on, you mentioned reformulation. I guess I have a bit of an underlying concern that so many people are going to be going around that reformulation, because that nutrition model, it's obviously an algorithm. Firstly, is that something that you think about, that companies will be manipulating some of these products to fit to be outside of scope so then they can put it back on the shelf? Is that something that you've thought about, concerned about, or maybe is there some legislation around how they can manipulate some of these products? Sorry, that might be a bit of a hard.
No, it's definitely happening. So the reformulation to specifically fall outside of the scope of the nutrition profile model and therefore the legislation is definitely something that's happened. I'd argue that that's not a problem if it's making the product healthier, which it often has to be. So they might be increasing things like fruit content or nuts, reducing sugar, whatever else they are that they're doing to change that product, which is essentially what you want them to be doing. The model isn't perfect. There is a 2018 nutrient profile model that's coming in, only 2019, only just coming in now, which is stricter. So whether or not they will make this legislation going forward use the updated model, I'm sure retailers will be thrilled to make those changes. But I suspect there will be tightening of these, and definitely if legislation going forward will use the new profile model, but nothing's perfect. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how the nervous system would have fared in this experiment compared to the HFSS?
That's a really good question. Well, I think pretty much everything would have been out of scope, so it would have been really interesting to know. It would all have been largely non-food products that would have been at the end of aisles and things, I think. It's obviously a controversial topic. I think given the diet situation in the UK and the cost of living crisis, etc., to focus on things like baked beans and things like that is probably not the way forward, or wholemeal bread, or So I wouldn't be one arguing for a move towards the NOVA classification over the HFSS classification. I think the HFSS classification could be massively improved, but I don't know that we have the data on processing yet to support legislation that focuses on that.
Because South America has focused on that.
Well, Brazil in particular.
That's where it originates.
Sorry, just following on the reformulation kind of part, I'm not sure in the supermarket of the UK, but at least in Sydney and in Australia, there were large aisle of the supplements kind of things. Not sure if there's any legislation or any kind of things. Is that kind of legislation kind of promoting the supplements sales in that case? In supplements is a grey area, kind of a little bit lack of evidence kind of.
Where the supplements would be moved to some of these prime locations. So I'm not sure that the UK has quite so much of a focus on supplements as Australia. Obviously, it's a thing, but I definitely get the impression it's much more of a thing here. And you don't get large sales of those kind of products within supermarkets. You would see them more within pharmacies or specific shops that are specific for that. That might change. And it may be that kind of, yeah, I don't think those products, they tend to be put in places near the pharmacy section of these supermarkets anyway. I don't think they would appear on your general aisles. I don't think the sales are sufficient for that to be worthwhile at the moment. It certainly never came up. No one mentioned it at any point. None of the retailers mentioned it at any point. It's not something that they're focusing on.
Ali, this has been a fabulous, I've just realised the time, so one. And so thank you so much for coming and sharing your research with us. It's really amazing. And it's been a fabulous